One of the key distinctions between complicated systems and complex systems is self-organization. And when you have a self-organizing system, when you look at a cell, it was not designed exogenously like a computer chip was. So they had fundamentally different processes of coming about. So complex systems are the result of self-interacting dynamics and evolutionary processes. So you have self-interacting dynamics, and the things that are effective end up getting selected for, and then you keep having these increased effectiveness selection dynamics. And one of the interesting things about self-organizing systems is the way they have non-arbitrary boundaries. The relationship of the cell to the world around it, the plant, the animal, whatever it is, to the rest of the world around it has a non-arbitrary boundary where you have the agency of that system being able to move within the environment, externalize entropy outside of the system, and have sensory input of some kind, information processing and actuator output. Complicated systems are totally different in all of those processes. The advent of what we call modern science with Galileo, Descartes, really codified with Newton and going beyond, started working with small variable systems where you had an angle and how much gunpowder, and that was really all that was needed. And in those small variable systems, classical mechanics and specifically reductionism, taking a very complex idea like how do we win a war, finding a couple key variables, bringing it all down to those key variables was super useful, right? It was so useful. We didn't need dowsing rods anymore. We didn't need guesses. In fact, it was so much more effective than all those systems that it became the dominant system for knowing how to do things. And we started being able to get into systems that had more variables than just a couple. But then as you start to encounter the natural world, the biological world, and you start to deal with complex systems where you have not just a slightly larger number of, but still distinct variables, but you have nearly indefinite number of variables. You have bottom-up and top-down effects. They're all radically interacting where they co-evolved in such a way that the variables it studied in isolation actually do different things than they do in synergy, in combinatorics of that context. So context ends up defining the thing very profoundly. Then just looking at a small number of variables and then putting it back together and not realizing that those variables actually do different things in isolation than they did together, and they do different things with synergies of them than they did separately, doesn't end up being adequate. Our systems of medicine have done really good where the cause of illness were small number of variable causes, like acute illness, right? The issue comes from a bullet wound or a car accident or something where you can't trace the causation to something fairly acute. Then we're pretty good at being able to reverse that, and that's where Western medicine has really proliferated. But if you have cancer or autoimmune disease or neurodegenerative disease or any kind of complex chronic scenarios that are multifactorial, there might be some elements of toxicity involved, some elements of pathogenicity, some elements of deficiency, some genetics, some psychoneuroimmunology, like lots of things with delayed causation over time and then causal cascades where many different elements are interacting. We aren't able to trace the etiology of them. We're also looking for it to be the same etiology, that MS is one thing, that anxiety is one thing, and it's not. It is a set of similar-ish symptoms that can have not only many different causes, but different sets of those causes in different people in different contexts. We need fundamentally different epistemology, different processes of knowing and studying to do a good job with those kinds of things.
A lot of people are going to be nodding and following along, agreeing with that in principle, but also saying, yes, but everything that we hear from neuroscience is that the brain is still this really complicated, partially unknown frontier. And if there's maybe one area of science where we don't know enough of the fine, minute specifics yet to be able to move away from reductionism, the brain might be it. Would you disagree with that statement? Would you think that we're near some sort of swing point or tipping point? What's your general thoughts there?
I would say we need to frame up the topic differently. So in reductionism, our goal is to take a complex system and break it down into subsystems that are simpler and break those down into subsystems. And that's the direction of specialization. So we take health and we look at neurology and gastroenterology and oncology and rheumatology, right? We break the body into these kinds of anatomical tract systems, try to understand those. One of the problems ends up being here that you can have gut issues that a gastroenterologist should be looking at that are affecting brain issues via gut-brain axis dynamics, via microbiome, via enteric nervous system, right? Like so many different dynamics. And so the cross-system effects, it's actually a reason that there's an assumption that whole systems effects are harder and further away epistemologically from here than reductionist answers. And I'm actually saying that reductionist answers are infinitely far away because they can never solve these things. Ultimately, we'll always be reductionist in that we will always be looking at a subset of everything that is involved.
Yeah.
We're never going to know that every variable that's involved we have perfect confidence margins on. So we're reducing the whole to some subset, but the key is that we seek to have that be not only a growing subset, but that we understand the interconnectedness more. Obviously, we've been in Western allopathic medicine and science in general trying to understand more and more variables, understanding all the complex interactions between them and how they self-organize. Complex, not complicated interactions, applying a different kind of thinking to how it emerged that way is where we have a lot of room for growth right now. And that's the whole systems biology movement. So we move from these anatomical tracks to these similarly causal worlds of looking at the body. Genomics, microbiomics, transcriptomics, connectomics, the whole world of things like this that are involved at a level of self-organization. We're very far away from understanding the human connectome or the human genome adequately. Even though we've sequenced the genome, combinatorics on those genes, and then gene expression, and then recursion at the level of what's happening in the blood to changing gene expression is something that we're quite far from.
Owning a book versus being an expert in that book and what the author actually meant and all the various interpretations are two very different things.
Very different things. But the movement to start trying to take what seem like very different areas of study and understand how this one system evolved to have all of these parts interacting is, I would say, one of the frontiers of the biological sciences right now.